Boa tarde a todos, clientes. Boa tarde a todos, clientes do Itaú Private Bank. É um prazer estar aqui de novo. Estamos na nossa live mensal Market Update e hoje falar de um tema extremamente sensível que está mexendo nos mercados ainda e para entender um pouquinho melhor de tudo isso. A gente vai fazer a live em português, a gente vai fazer a live em inglês, como sempre. O Raj está aqui me acompanhando, a gente tem o Jacob, a gente já vai fazer a apresentação, mas a gente tem o canal com tradução simultânea também, se tiver preferência para escutar em português, é só clicar embaixo da sua tela. Mas quero agradecer a todo mundo de novo por estar aqui, espero que a gente tenha uma ótima live, que vocês encontrem um assunto bastante interessante, até para a gente conectar com economia e mercados e portfólio. Raj, thank you very much for joining us again. It's happy to be here with you.
Great. I'd like to welcome Jacob Kirkegaard from 22V, who's here to discuss geopolitics with a focus on the recent conflict between Israel and Iran. It's great that we have a ceasefire, but I think there's still a lot to discuss. Just a quick background in terms of 22V. It's a research broker that delivers top-tier equity and macroeconomic insights, backed by robust global sales and trading capabilities. And one thing that sets them apart is the analysts, similar to Jacob here. Many that come from buy side, but also government agencies, combined with client engagement that goes beyond just reports. It's videos, webinars, and direct interactions and bespoke sessions just like this one. So thanks for joining us. To give a quick background on Jacob, our speaker, he's a senior managing director, head of European research at 22V. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He previously worked for the Danish Ministry of Defense and the United Nations in Iraq. He's also authored and published many research papers and appears regularly in global media like the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and CNBC. So welcome, Jacob. And it's great to have you here to share your expertise with us. And I'll pass it back to Marcelo to get the discussion started.
All right, that's a great intro. Thank you again, Jacob, for joining us. Why don't we cut to the chase and go right after a couple of questions then. So my first one, after welcoming, of course, it's there's been a lot of debate recently. It's probably one of the most trending topic in terms of how effective or what was the success of the attacks in terms of U.S. into the Iran's nuclear program, and what kind of damage did actually occur. We hear different stories. If you look to different outlets, media outlets, or even different countries and media statement, I would love to hear your thoughts on how successful Israel and U.S. attacks in the Iranian nuclear program really was.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to join you and Itaú today. On that question, I think the short answer is no one knows. The Iranians knows, but they're not going to tell us. Today we heard from the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, who said that there was no doubt that the Iranian program has suffered very extensive damage. But he also said that the program isn't quote unquote destroyed. So what I think we can say is that the known main sort of reprocessing or centrifuging locations in Natanz, Fordow, and to a certain extent in Isfahan, they have almost certainly been destroyed. So it seems likely that a very large amount of Iranian centrifuges and thereby the capacity to further enrich uranium has probably been destroyed. But what also seems the case is that the roughly just over 400 kilos of relatively highly enriched, about 60%, that's just below weapons grade uranium. We don't know where that is. You've heard claims by U.S. Defense Secretary Hegseth and others members of the Trump team that it was all located in one of the destroyed facilities at Fordow. We don't know. But I have to say, I personally regard it as unlikely that the Iranians would have risked storing all that highly enriched uranium in one location. So I think that, therefore, we have to assume that Iran still has a sizable amount of highly enriched uranium in the possession of the regime. Which means that they will probably have great difficulties producing more, but that doesn't mean that over time they wouldn't be able to, fully enrich this remaining already relatively highly enriched uranium and maybe even weaponize it. So the bottom line is a major setback, the reconfiguration of the plant, the program, but certainly we have, I think it is highly unlikely that it has been fully destroyed.
Yeah, no, I agree, and the question remains. We'll see the next steps, but thank you for the answer. Moving towards the very welcomed ceasefire. But there's a lot of discussions, including by you, whether that's permanent or not, right? Given the fact that the central issue, probably the main disagreement was not necessarily solved between the two countries. So can you discuss a little bit on what is the main issue that hasn't been necessarily resolved, and how and when do you see the ceasefire ending, if that comes to that?
I mean, I think fundamentally what we saw in this most recent confrontation, I mean, the direct strikes between Iran and Israel obviously started already last year. But what we saw in the last couple of weeks is really a further tilting of the military balance in favor of Israel. Israeli Air Force basically had air superiority over Iran for a very extended period of time. It is true that Iran was able to fire ballistic missiles back at Israel. They hit population centers and other things. But currently, estimates suggest that about 85 to maybe up to 90% of these ballistic missiles were actually intercepted. So therefore, I think it's fair to say that what we have now is a situation where a resumption of this conflict from an Israeli point of view will be probably less costly going forward, simply because it will be very, very difficult for Iran to reconstitute its ballistic missile program to shoot back, and certainly also reconstitute its air defense system, because they're not going to get any air defense from Russia or any other place. So what we have is that I believe if Israel, or when I would rather say, Israel gets high quality intelligence, and we have seen throughout this conflict that Israeli intelligence penetration of the Iranian regime is extremely extensive. They literally knew where many of the generals were. And I personally have no doubt that if they had wanted to kill the supreme leader Khamenei, they probably could have done so. So when Israel gets good intelligence on where, for instance, some of the remaining highly enriched uranium is located, I suspect they will bomb it. I suspect they will break the ceasefire, because they have said from the beginning that they have more confidence in the Israeli Air Force than in a possible hypothetical future reintroduction of International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors. Israel trusts, its armed forces more than the international community. So I think that, in my opinion, is most likely how this ceasefire is broken. It is also possible, however, that the other way goes around, that there are parts of the Iranian regime, the Islamic Republican Guard Corps, that feels the need for domestic political reasons or some other reason to shoot at Israel, and they still have missiles to do so. So it may also be Iran that does so, either through a direct missile defense. Iran may also choose other sort of hybrid warfare, going after quote unquote soft Israeli targets around the world. They have done so before, including, of course, even in Latin America, a number of years ago against the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires. So those types of things. So for me, because of the relative low costs for Israel to break this ceasefire. I think it will when they get access, which I again think they will at some point, access to good intelligence of a nuclear program related target inside Iran.
Yeah, very complete view. Let me shift a little bit towards market so far, and we're going to look at perspective for future markets and talk a little bit about oil. But so far has been a volatile, year, to be honest. But in terms of this specific conflict and how it escalate in the last few weeks, how are markets reacting? Rates, even the equity market, your space, Raj. I would love to hear a little bit. We already got a couple of questions. I'm trying to summarize them in terms of a market view from everything that's happening, the geopolitical side.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you take a step back, I think we've had clearly a lot of conflicts over the last couple of years. Russia, Ukraine, October 7th, the Israel-Palestine conflict. So this kind of culminated. I would say markets were volatile, but if you look at what we've saw even prior to this with the tariff news and other things, they actually took it relatively well. The market was down, S&P a few percent, but I think similar to maybe what Jacob mentioned, I think that Israel was able to show some pretty high level of control or dominance, made it so that the conflict was contained, even Israel's defense. So it didn't spread, and it didn't spread to the Strait of Hormuz, which I know we'll talk about later. I think the fact that it was contained made the market feel handle it well. But I think there's also been some anticipation, as I mentioned, the conflicts over time. So I think overall the market generally took it well. We saw a move in oil, we saw gold, equity sell off, which is what you would typically see. We actually recently published in one of the weekly Globes. We looked at it was a mid-year update on the markets on the equity side. We also did a similar for emerging market debt. But on that report, we also looked at previous conflicts and said, okay, what do markets do when there is a conflict like this? And we went back all the way to the 70s. And you see oil go up, gold go up, and equities sell off. But over time,
no cryptocurrency in the 70s though. But that's a different topic.
Exactly. And so the impact though is dampened over time, and a lot of that is because if you go back to the 70s, oil was a bigger impact. One, you saw the magnitude. If you go to the 70s, oil doubled and tripled, and then also it was a much bigger part of the economy. And so I think if you go back and look at different conflicts, it tends to be short-term in nature, impacts for markets. And then what matters is what's going on in the underlying economy. I mean, we look back at 9/11, for example, and during that period, the economy was already weak. So if you're already in a weak position and you have something like this, then obviously you can push it into a recession. But we're starting from a relatively good place if you look at the U.S. economy or the global economy. And so I think that helped.
Maybe I'll take the thank you, Raj. As a segue, I'm going to skip ahead a couple of questions here, Jacob, and maybe go towards the oil markets, which is one of the major concerns, especially when you talk about Middle East, any kind of conflict, and how can that affect oil prices, and then the whole inflation discussion comes back into the plate. But now knowing that, at least for now, that the Strait of Hormuz, it's not going to be blocked, which is a big piece of information here. Can you elaborate your views in terms of the oil market, given the conflict, Jacob? I would love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, in my view, the longer term trend in the oil market has been towards too much supply, basically. And I think from that perspective, what we saw during the conflict was that it was revealed, in my opinion, that the possibility of even a resumption, I mean, even when, as I said, the ceasefire will eventually be broken, in my opinion, even when that happens, I think the market reaction will be extremely muted. Because what we saw during this confrontation was that even when we breached a bunch of previously unthinkable red lines, we basically had the United States, launch its first direct attack on Iran proper, drop a large number, in fact, of its largest ordnance. If the U.S. wanted to drop something bigger, they'd have to drop a nuclear bomb on Iran. That would be the sort of next logical escalation. That's how far up the escalation ladder we went. And in response to that, what Iran chose to do was to launch the possibly most scripted retaliation in history. We already saw back when Trump in his first term killed the former head of the Republican Guard, Soleimani. They sort of did a scripted attack against some US bases in Iraq. I mean, this time the scripture, if you like, was even more extensive. I mean, they literally called up the Qataris and said, well, you've got this more or less empty US base at Al Udeid. Let's lob some missiles at it. And we'll let you know when and where to ensure that nothing happened. It's just very difficult for me to think a scenario in which, that Iran would want to escalate to actually attacking the Gulf crude oil trade. Also because, Iran, a lot of Iranian infrastructure has been lost. They need to rebuild. They need money. This is already a regime that has been in a lot of financial trouble. So for them to, destroy the pillar on which their own economy is built, I don't think would be particularly smart, even for a long-term regime survivability point of view. So therefore, I think the only scenario in which it becomes, possible, even or even more than anything more than a remote small probability for closing the Straits of Hormuz or attacks on Saudi or Emirati or other oil facilities is really regime instability in Iran, where you have a rogue faction, within the regime that's at risk of a civil war that decides to do so. But as long as the regime in Iran is still firmly in control, which I would certainly venture that it is, I think that probability is extremely low, which is one more reason why the cost to Israel of shooting at a target inside Iran again is very low, because there's not going to be any blowback, material blowback, in my opinion, from the oil markets. That's why, in my view, the Iran-Israel conflict now actually looks a little bit like the conflict that we used to have in southern Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah, which obviously was the principal Iranian proxy, where basically you had a ceasefires came and went. There was a blowout, regularly, with some bombings and some missiles lobbed back at Israel. But to be blunt, nobody cared. And that why, obviously people in the region cared, but nobody else. And I think actually, given how far up the escalation ladder we've gone, this is where the Iran-Israel conflict will be going forward. It will flare up again, but I don't think there will be any more than, quite frankly, a temporary blip in oil markets from a very temporary increase in global risk premia or perceptions thereof.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Speak back on a couple of things that you mentioned, even in terms of the costs to rebuild the arsenal and whatnot. But from an economic perspective, one of the questions that we got from someone in the chat was, can Iran, from an economic perspective, from having money, like just resources to keep fighting that without a strong, let's say, ally also helping financially, how far can they go? Is that an issue for them right now? Is that something that also factor in their response, or just a little bit scary in terms of the US? Is economic power and just financial support is a factor for Iran to keep this long term?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is already a regime that is under severe economic constraints from Trump's maximum pressure. And, quite frankly, also because of Iran's alliance with Russia, Iran has lost all support in Europe. I mean, if you go back to the original negotiation of the first Iran nuclear deal, this was something that at least a number of the European countries, led by Germany, really wanted because they wanted to trade to a certain extent with Iran. Well, all that is gone. And obviously, the alliance with Russia didn't do, it didn't really help them very much. So no, this is a financially very weakened regime. And while obviously the domestic political situation inside Iran is highly uncertain, I think at some level it has to have had an impact. That this was a regime that, colloquially put, have told the Iranian population to eat grass or at least suffer lots of economic hardship so that the regime could build what they claimed was a necessary nuclear program and a military industrial complex, etc., that could protect Iran against, Israel and the United States. Well, we have just seen the total, complete, and utter failure of that, domestic military defense capability in Iran. So I would have to think that there would be some Iranians at least thinking, well, was it all worth it? So absolutely, this is, I think, the only card, therefore, that Iran has to play is because it needs money. It is credible, and I think actually, if you're the Trump administration, and if you listen to some of the things that people like Steve Witkoff and others have been saying, that there is a possible deal here, which actually would fit, I think, at some level, some months from now, also the Trump administration, where Iran basically said, look, we will exchange sanctions, some lifting of the sanctions to be able to earn more money in return for a return of collaboration with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Because we don't know, and whatever the Trump administration says today for obvious political reasons, they won't know a couple of months either what actually is the state of the Iranian nuclear program. The only way to get some better information from Iran proper is to have the inspectors back. And obviously, if you're Trump, you want generally lower oil prices to fight against or to counter the any tariff-related increase in inflation in the U.S., bringing back additional Iranian crude to global markets in an unsanctioned way, probably from that perspective makes good policy. And even the Israelis would probably go along with it, knowing that they have such a military dominance that if they see something, as I said earlier, if they see something in Iran that they would want to shoot at, they'll probably do it. So I can see a deal that really, where Iran will have to accept a much more intrusive inspector regime simply because they really, truly need the money.
Yeah. So talking about potential deals and even ceasefire, what are the odds that Iran will stay put or pull out of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty? And what is that exactly, if you don't mind?
I mean, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is basically the international treaty that countries join and commit to having a civilian-only nuclear program, that they will not pursue weaponization or a nuclear weapon. Now that, of course, many countries over the years have been members of that, or almost all of it has. Some have broken that commitment, right? But obviously Israel and many others will say that the Iranians have too. But the Iranians will say, well, no, we just have a peaceful nuclear program. Now, of course, given that you have enriched uranium to 60%, that would suggest something else. But I think the probability that Iran will actually withdraw from the NPT is very low, because it would almost certainly condemn them to a lot of, possibly even at the UN level, sanctions. And it would certainly displease their principal economic partner in China. Because one of the few things that China cares about, other than, of course, China, is actually nuclear non-proliferation. Because China does not have an incentive for nuclear proliferation to expand. They are currently the only, well, obviously with the exception of North Korea, but they're the only major nuclear power in Asia If nuclear proliferation were to begin, I would think it would certainly spread to countries like Japan, a clear nuclear threshold power, South Korea, and from a Chinese perspective, God forbid, even Taiwan, right? So if Iran were to do this, China, I believe, would be not very happy. So Iran has done something else, which I think is makes more sense, but it can also be reversed more easily. They have said they are stopping active collaboration with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which basically means that there's no formal basis for reestablishing the inspection regime or for a new. They've sort of increased the threshold a little bit for what it would take to get a new nuclear deal. As I said, I still think over the next 2 or 3 months, such a deal is at quite a high probability. And that would see inspectors come back, which is another way of saying that certainly, withdrawal from the NPT is a very low probability, in my opinion. It would be unnecessarily, they would just it would cause a deterioration of China's relationship with its few principal remaining, trading partners especially in China.
Thank you, Raj. Just also getting some questions here in terms of, again, connecting a little bit to the market, not necessarily only about this specific conflict, but we've been seeing a little bit more risky conflicts or scenarios popping up in the last, again, few months or quarters. That includes the tariffs, a couple of not only this conflict, but other conflicts as well. Threats of Taiwan has been on the table for quite some time. How are we positioning portfolios in terms of assessing that specific risk? I think U.S. recession is kind of out of the table right now, not necessarily out of the table. There's always a chance, but it's smaller than it was maybe 6 months ago. Yeah. But at the same time, we have maybe more on this tail risks from a bunch of different things. So I know it's your specialty is equities, but as a part of the investment committee, how are we positioning for that kind of thing?
Yeah. So look, the portfolios that we have fixed income and treasuries as a component, which historically, when there's conflicts, can provide a hedge. It depends, obviously, in the type of conflict. Oil prices moving up can also obviously be inflationary, but generally the treasury market tends to be an area where you can get some protection. Cash as well. So within our portfolios, we do have a cash allocation. It's less now. But I think the other thing, look, there's you mentioned the tariff news, which is you can say it's a conflict in terms of an economic conflict, yes. U.S. versus the rest of the world, in certain parts of the world, and we've had a view that this is a view recently that the dollar will weaken, and so this is just kind of an indication that it makes sense to diversify. So there's been, if you look over the last decade or more, there's been U.S. exceptionalism, U.S. markets doing well. Dollar has been strong, and kind of we've shifted to this view. And look, it gives diversification, and any kind of if you look at portfolio analysis, having diversification through conflicts is one of the best hedges, right? You jokingly talked about crypto, but it's gold as an example is an asset diversifier. And so I think from our standpoint, when we look at our portfolios, the view of non-dollar assets to diversify, we've gone overweight emerging market equities as part of that. So this kind of gives you a sense of maybe not having as much concentration as you had in the past with just U.S. looking outside, whether it's other parts of developed markets like Europe, Japan, but also which are if we look at the DXY as a currency, and then also looking at emerging market equity. So I think that's how we've kind of thought about it. Yeah. Diversification can be your friend.
Perfect. And yeah, except for maybe COVID and a couple of other situations, treasury or fixed income markets could support us very much so as well. Jacob, you mentioned the level of Israeli intelligence in terms of knowing exactly where big names in terms of the army or intelligence for Iran. Do you think that they could potentially target Khamenei as well, are they looking for a change in the Iran regime, or is that something that right now seems to be stable and that's not something they're looking for? Of course, opinion, it's hard to know exactly what is going on their intelligence
Yeah, I
side.
mean, as I said, I'm convinced that had they wanted to kill the supreme leader Khamenei, they could have done so. And I'm also convinced that certainly towards the end of the military campaign, there were very clear indications that they were trying to weaken core elements of the, shall we say, repressive apparatus of the regime inside Iran. You know, they bombed the main television station, they bombed key installations of the domestically focused Revolutionary Guard, the Basiji, militia headquarters, other police headquarters, clearly aimed at weakening the domestic repressive regime. So from an Israeli point of view, undermining the regime clearly became at least part of the goal of the campaign. And I think it's a logical conclusion, because I think the Israelis must also have known that a complete destruction of the nuclear program was probably impossible, because we don't know the whereabouts, and they don't know the whereabouts of all the highly enriched uranium. So from that perspective, getting rid of the regime would be a logical, if not second best, then probably ultimately the only way. But I really want to stress that using the term regime change is highly misleading. Because it brings back sort of a reference to, say, Iraq after the US invasion in 2003. But the situation is very, very different. Obviously, in Iraq, the US invaded and conquered Iraq and was in military control. So they could decide what regime to change to. That's not the situation in Iran, and it will never be. So what you would get in Iran, no one knows. I certainly wouldn't want to venture to speculate what would happen. So what Israel was really trying to generate was a popular uprising and a collapse of the current regime. And they clearly based on an assumption from an Israeli point of view, which I think is not unreasonable, that actually any regime any situation is better than the current regime. Even one in which, for instance, as I said, Gulf Arab oil and the Strait of Hormuz might, as part of chaos inside Iran, might be more at risk than today. But again, this is. I certainly don't think that the Trump administration, or for that matter, most other countries in the world, would share that relative acceptance of the incredible disruption and uncertainty that a regime collapse in Iran would generate. So this would be another one of the reasons for why, other than Donald Trump's ego, that the Trump administration was so keen on ending this conflict sooner rather than later.
Yeah, that does explain, as you mentioned, essentially they had the opportunity to target the supreme leader, but this will not necessarily be the end game here. I appreciate it, just because we got a couple of questions. I got another one for you, Raj, and I'm sorry I'm throwing a question. I think it's a very good segue.
No, it's good to be interactive.
Yeah, perfect, especially timing wise. The first few questions were about risks, right, in terms of how to protect the portfolio given that specific scenario, not only this conflict, but overall. But there's another one in terms of opportunities, right? Where are there opportunities and how we're positioned in terms of U.S. equities? I know we have a global growth, focus more on the US, but a global growth call open as a tactical view for the calls. Of course, we try to see and look through the portfolio for a longer term, but we try to take advantage of imbalances in the market using tactical calls and even almost trading oriented, but of course not a day trade, but kind of a 6 months kind of view. Selling dollars versus other currencies, which is also a call that we have open. the EM equities that you mentioned. So what kind of opportunities are coming out of this regime, economics regime?
So I guess, and actually one thing that I forgot from the previous question when you mentioned, okay, portfolio, how do you protect against these scenarios? Look, options are another way. And so we are seeing, in certain cases, again, this is for certain clients that, trade options or even structured notes, you can take advantage of volatility, and volatility has come down. So if you look at the how expensive or cheap protection is, it's actually much cheaper now than it was when we were in the peak of the tariff related noise. So again, you can use structured notes or the things to get protection. And so that's what you're trying, it's an insurance, right? You have to pay something for it, or giving up some upside or something like that. So those are some things that we are seeing as a way to kind of mitigate some of the downside. Back to the opportunities and what it, what we can get when there's periods of volatility. We do have an overweight on global growth equities. We've had a view since January of 2023. So if you look at the market monitor where we have our sector views, we've liked growth equities since then. A lot of that has been driven by AI, right? Artificial intelligence is a big theme, and that started. ChatGPT was launched right around that time when we went overweight growth, and we actually made that as a tactical call from the committee from an overall perspective. And I think the global part is trying to also send the message that it's not just U.S. I mean, obviously, U.S. is a big part of it. You've seen this year specifically the Chinese with Alibaba, DeepSeek, and others come out. So I think those are the type of opportunities. And when you look back at even periods like April, when we had the volatility due to tariffs, I think it goes back to what we kind of do in terms of when we look at companies and sectors that we like within our top picks or our market monitor. Okay, which are the companies that have the best positions long term? So growth companies, as we mentioned, have a very good long-term earnings picture, but companies with good balance sheets that can structurally withstand volatility. Because again, going back to COVID or the financial crisis, if you had stuck with the companies with the best balance sheets and the best growth prospects at that time, you were fine. But if you were with lower quality companies, financial crisis that some went bankrupt, your equity gets wiped out, right? So you want to be able to hold that equity through a crisis and not be forced to be take a big loss. And so from our perspective, many of the names that we recommend on the single stock level in the top picks and watch list are the higher quality, best quality companies in the world that you can hold hopefully through most kind of periods of volatility.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. Right. Appreciate it. Then again, this is more asset allocation kind of portfolio view. There's always something that we can do in a more tactical, like a little bit more specific, such as options and other opportunities. But that would be maybe too details to go into this call. But happy to talk to your banker, investor, trading desk is very happy. We've been trading options a lot, to be honest. Volumes are going through the roof, single names as well. So there is opportunity, of course, but there's always a time and a place for specific trades. Moving towards a little bit more shifting gears or shifting the angle here, Jacob. Where is US in all of that, right? If you're sitting in the White House, what can you expect, or what are you looking for coming, participating a little bit more further, almost escalating this? But what is the American perspective on the conflict?
Well, I mean, I think Donald Trump will always be the American president that bombed Iran. And I think why did he do it? Well, I think first of all, he did it for the same reason that Israel has it, that the potential cost to the United States from this attack was quite low, right? The US is obviously on a net basis relatively self-sufficient with fossil fuels. So he had a freedom from the sort of slavery of the oil markets that previous presidents obviously did not have because of the shale revolution. And then Donald Trump, to some extent, campaigned on being a peace president. He's obviously failed in Russia and Ukraine. And he may have felt that, and I think this could still lead to something, right? I mean, he did what Benjamin Netanyahu wanted him to do, and has been wanting him to do for a very long time, namely to bomb these nuclear facilities. So will he now turn around to Benjamin Netanyahu, possibly after I think, likely election in Israel that may or may not lead to, I'm sure Netanyahu will still be prime minister, but from a broader point of view, we may hope that he gets a different coalition, so that he may, for instance, following such an election, or even as part of the election campaign, move to a more permanent ceasefire in Gaza, or at least a stop for the ongoing warfare. That would then turn into an opportunity for Donald Trump to once again return to the Abraham Accords, because obviously the Saudis, in my opinion, remain very keen on that. But there needs to be some sort of solution to the Gaza conflict. But if Benjamin Netanyahu rides his success in Iran to an election victory, a new coalition, and Trump continues to put pressure on him, basically telling him, dude, I did what you wanted me to do. Now you got to do something for me. This could lead, and I think this was also this sort of transactional quid pro quo, plus that Trump wanted to be the guy who delivered peace, at least in one part of the world. I think that's what drove it. What Trump is clearly not interested in, and I think no American wouldn't be interested in, is sort of putting boots on the ground or continuing the massive U.S. military presence in the Middle East. There's no really strategic reason for that anymore, given where I believe global oil markets and certainly domestic oil and gas supply is in the United States. It's just a matter of being able to withdraw from the region without it falling into chaos. And for that, a broader normalization between Israel and, the Arab world, and of course, a general check on the current Iranian regime's designs are necessary. So I think from that perspective, what Trump did was potentially a good medium to long-term foreign policy move, even if of course, in the short term was an unprecedented escalation.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe a segue. What about, we always expect U.S. kind of to lead the way, especially in this global kind of conflicts. How is Europe perspective on all of this? Of course, Europe has several different countries, but what's the European take on the conflict? We haven't seen them as involved, of course, but I'd love to hear your perspective, if there are any.
No, I mean, look, I think the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said it very clearly. I mean, he literally told the main German domestic news show that Israel is doing Europe's, quote, dirty work. And what this suggests is that, Europe has swung from being generally neutral on Iran to being a very strong opponent of the current regime, mostly because of the Iranian-Russian alliance. So what this means is that despite that there is general discontent in Europe with the Israeli war and conduct in Gaza, this attack is not going to lead to any European reactions, partly because the EU remains hopelessly split on this issue. But so in that sense, you could say, well, Europe remains, quote unquote, relatively irrelevant when it comes to diplomacy in the Middle East. But it has shifted away from being neutral to being hostile to Iran. And that, again, as I said earlier, represents a further isolation of Iran in various, sort of broader international and economic affairs.
Thank you, Jacob. And we've been focused very much on Iran and Israel, but just a few months ago, Israel also was in the front with different regimes, right? What happened now with Gaza, Lebanon, Hezbollah? Do you think there's also consequences or derivatives into that front, or not anymore?
I think, we saw something quite extraordinary during the conflict, recent conflict. We saw an official statement by Hezbollah saying that, well, we condemn the Israeli attacks on Iran, but we're not going to do anything about it. Recalling that Hezbollah was created by and financed and trained and armed by Iran over several decades with the sole purpose of striking Israel as a deterrent for Israeli attacks on Iran. Hezbollah's strategic role in the Middle East, in my opinion, is probably over. What they have suffered, both because of the relatively recent Israeli attacks on them, the political shift in Lebanon, and of course the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, is probably terminal. Doesn't mean that it will disappear completely, but it means that as a strategic, factor in Middle East and a constraint on Israel, Hezbollah is history. I think to some extent the same is true on the Houthis. You may recall that immediately after the U.S. bombing of Iran, the Houthis said, "Oh, the ceasefire with the U.S. is over, and we're going to start shooting at U.S. Ships in the Red Sea." Have we seen any such attacks? No, we have not. Are the Houthis in a position to once again, begin to pick a fight with the United States and Israel? I strongly doubt it. So again, what we're seeing is the collapse of all the Iranian financed proxy forces around the region. That leaves us with Gaza. Now, Gaza is obviously Israel has, I think, to the greatest extent possible, destroyed Hamas. They've killed the leadership. They have destroyed most of their armed groups or trained armed forces, but they have not destroyed Hamas as an organization, which you cannot really do unless you install something else or maintain a full military, repressive, presence throughout Gaza, which Israel is not interested in, and it doesn't have the manpower without sort of semi-permanent mobilization. So Gaza still represents a strategic debacle for Israel. There needs to be some sort of solution. And again, I think ultimately Netanyahu, if he gets another coalition, a governing coalition, might be willing to do so. It will require a lot of pressure from Trump, but I think Trump is actually willing to do that because, let's be honest, without catering too much to his ego, the only way Donald Trump, is even talked about for that Nobel Peace Prize is if he delivers a two-state solution in Israel-Palestine with the Abrahamic Accords. Now, I know it sounds far-fetched, but when we're talking about what drives Donald Trump's decision-making in the Middle East, where, as I said, it's no longer oil, it's no longer economic imperatives, a lot of it is just politics and Trump's personal whims. I wouldn't rule it out. But Gaza remains an unsolved issue.
That's very insightful. Maybe from last but not least, in terms of different angles, what about China or Russia? How do they fit into this whole conflict?
Well, I think again, China has been AWOL. Russia has been AWOL despite, they have not featured, despite signing, having benefited tremendously from Iranian support in their assault on Ukraine. And Iran has been, sorry, China has been largely absent as well, despite that actually it's China and the Asian countries that actually get most of their oil from the Persian Gulf region. So they from an economic point of view should actually be, I guess, more involved.
Yeah.
So what it shows is, I think that neither of these two countries really are interested in taking over any or play any prominent role in the Middle East. Probably having seen, what a debacle it has been for the United States over many decades, right? It's not really, you don't necessarily want to be the hegemon, quote unquote, from the outside in the Middle East. It's very costly and it's not really clear what it provides you. Obviously, if you're China and you're very rapidly decarbonizing and cutting your dependency on imported fuels, why would you want to for geopolitical reasons only and not geo-economic reasons to really get involved in the region? And I think we have seen that here again. And then I think also it's worth noting that, which is another one of the side effects of Trump's attack on Iran. We used to say, Taco and Trump would never do it. He was, he would always chicken out and all that. But as I said, he will forever be the president who bombed Iran. He actually pulled the trigger. What that means is that if you're Xi Jinping and you're wondering, okay, how will Trump respond if I move against Taiwan? Well, at least uncertainty about Trump's response function will now have increased. So the risk for China of doing so will have gone up, which again, I think makes the probability of an imminent conflict in Taiwan lower. And the same in some ways is true with Russia, where not against Ukraine, of course, but against, people talk about Russia testing Article 5 in NATO. We've obviously just this week had a very successful, I would argue, NATO summit where Trump, was already sort of re-engaging and expressed his happiness with NATO after having told Europeans that they were ripping off America, many times. So again, if you're Putin and you're thinking about doing that, you now have to factor in that Trump might be the guy that actually pulls the trigger. And actually, so uncertainty will have gone up, which again makes direct confrontations with the United States, or possible confrontations, much more risky for even major foreign governments and countries. And that, in some ways, is good because it lowers the risk of those types of conflicts, both in Asia and in Europe.
We still have a few questions, but I'll keep them for after a call. I have one last question. We have a couple of minutes. What keeps you up at night? Like, where are you deploying the most energy? What are you looking for? What are your main concerns, if you need to point it out, one going forward? Of course, we had the ceasefire. Things seems to be a little bit more stable. I think the whole tone of this presentation, if you have done on Monday, it would be much worse than it is right now. But they're still looking. There's still stuff. There's still things that concern us. What is the top piece of paper, on your desk, Jacob?
I mean, as I said, from an economic point of view, and from the perspective of possible, global risk premia, et cetera, continues to be, even though it's a relatively low probability, I would argue, but it is regime instability in Iran. Because that, I think, is the only scenario in which you get to a possible direct attack on either the Strait of Hormuz, tankers, etc., or crude oil export installations in other parts of the Gulf. So that is certainly one that I'm watching. And again, I don't think anybody has any control over that. But again, we don't know precisely how this will shape out going forward. So I certainly think that is a low probability. Then another thing that worries me is that we will continue to have. We just saw one today where an arson attack on a German military base. Clearly by Russian saboteurs or people sympathetic to Russia. So I certainly worry about Russian hybrid attacks throughout Europe, but also elsewhere. This could be cyber attacks against critical infrastructure in Europe, but also in the United States for that matter. By the way, Iran also has. It will be one way for Iran to strike back as well. They have done so or tried to do so many times against Israel. Israel is a very formidable place to try to do a cyber attack. But the skills of doing a cyber attack against critical infrastructure, where defenses are much lower in Europe or the United States, might succeed. And obviously, it'll be very difficult to track. So that's certainly also, and this could, if it, for instance, is related to the energy sector, have implications for, oil and gas prices in particular, electricity prices. So that's certainly another area that I watch very carefully.
Very good response. I know we only have 1 minute, but I would love to hear your thoughts as well. What keeps you up at night, market-wise?
I mean, look, I think short term, there is the tariff deadlines on July 9th that everyone's watching to see what happens. I think most market participants are expecting more deals, Japan, kind of the easy deals, right? And we haven't seen those. So I think as we get closer, I think the base case is still that there could get pushed out. This is a soft deadline. I think Japan will say, look, in the U.S. we're negotiating, but we're still finalizing the terms because can't do something in 90 days, right? These are complicated deals. So I think that's the short term kind of concern that's out there. Besides that, I think look, the economy, as we mentioned, is in pretty good shape. If I look at big parts of the U.S. Economy and markets, technology, it's doing well. We're going to be entering second quarter earnings season in July as well, more towards the middle to end of July. So we'll see what the company updates look like. And so I think we'll get some news in the next 2 months, but those are the things outside of that. I mean, I let Jacob discuss the geopolitical side of things, and I'm kind of
I would just say that certainly I also worry a lot about the tariff deadline. And I have to say I'm less optimistic than you are, Niraj. I think the base case, certainly with the EU and Japan, we just heard from the chief Japanese negotiator today or yesterday saying that a deal that didn't address the 25% auto tariffs for Japan was unacceptable. Well, I don't know. I find it hard to think that Trump would give that one up. And with the EU, it's kind of the same thing. Anyway, I'm quite pessimistic, unfortunately, on that one.
Can you guys still hear us?
Yep, I can.
All right. I think we froze for a quick second here. Jacob, do you want to wrap it up? I think you're in the middle of the sentence. At least
no, I was just gonna say, outside the Middle East, I would absolutely say the one thing that I do worry most about is the relatively unexpected increase in resurfacing of tariff and trade frictions with predominantly, of course, quote unquote U.S. allied or advanced economies, because I just don't see the deals being forthcoming.
Yeah, no. My question towards you were more directed to the conflict. Raj got the open question, but I think
which is why I highlighted it. Look, we don't know what I think if we had gotten more deals before July 9th, it would be easier to say that this is not a risk, but there is a level of uncertainty because we don't know what's happening. And I think when you have a tough situation, does Trump just decide to extend the deadline, which he can do, or does he get tough? And I think that's what we're going to be waiting to hear what happens in July.
Volatility backs on the menu.
Yeah.
Jacob, thank you very much. We're right on time. Extremely insightful, very, very helpful in terms of how to navigate. Thank you for joining us. It was a pleasure on behalf of Itaú and our clients, of course. I just want to say thank you. Raj, always happy to have you here. This is one of my highlights of the month for sure. You're saving the jokes. I know this is a heavy topic, but it's always something that I really enjoy doing with you. So thank you for coming here. To our clients, of course, muito obrigado por estarem aqui com a gente hoje e a gente se vê no mês que vem.
This discussion is intended for informational purposes only. This is not investment research or investment advice, and no recommendation or financial advice is being given. This discussion does not take into account individual investment objectives, financial condition, or investor needs. The views and opinions expressed in this discussion may differ from the views and opinions of other departments or divisions of Itaú and its affiliates.